I was barely tightening the last bolt on the new security gate when I heard the unmistakable screech of tires spinning too fast on gravel. I looked up and saw a beat-up white SUV barreling toward me, kicking up dust like a sandstorm. Out of the driver's seat jumped Karen, decked out in hiking boots, neon leggings, and a fanny pack that seemed to be armed for battle. She charged toward the gate, red-faced and panting, like I had just committed a war crime. Before I could say a word, she whipped out her phone, pointed it at me with trembling hands and barked, "You're being recorded! You're illegally blocking a historic trail." Her voice cracked halfway through the sentence, making it sound even more ridiculous. I stood there in my work boots, holding a wrench, confused but trying not to laugh as she shrieked into her phone, 911? Yes. I'd like to report a man for hostage-taking. He's trapping citizens on a public trail. It would have been funny if it wasn't so insane. Within minutes, 2 sheriff's deputies were racing down the dirt road toward us, lights flashing, sirens wailing, while Karen waved them in like she was directing fighter jets onto an aircraft carrier. I knew then that this was not going to be an ordinary Saturday. The deputies barely had time to unbuckle their seatbelts before Karen sprinted toward their cruiser, flailing her arms like an inflatable car dealership figure. "He's blocking access to the historical trail," she screamed, jabbing a finger at my perfectly legal, freshly installed gate. "People are stuck back there without water, without food. He's a monster!" she cried dramatically, spinning a story so wild that even the deputy had to squint at her in disbelief. Meanwhile, I calmly walked over, wiping my hands on a rag, and pointed to the 6 massive private property signs bolted to every fence post. The older deputy gave me a long look, then slowly turned back to Karen. "Ma'am, can you show us exactly which public trail you're talking about?" he asked carefully, like he was dealing with someone who might snap at any second. Karen puffed up like a toad and stomped right up to the gate. In a move that seemed ripped straight from a bad comedy movie, she grabbed the locked gate, tried to yank it open, slipped, and tumbled backward into the dirt, losing a sandal in the process. For a moment, everything froze. Then, as Karen struggled to untangle herself from a low bush, the younger deputy coughed to hide a laugh. Karen wasn't deterred. She scrambled to her feet, still barefoot on one side, and launched into a high-speed rant about how this land belonged to the people, and how she had a personal connection to this trail because her great-uncle's friend's cousin's roommate supposedly rode a horse through here back in the 1960s. I stood there blinking, trying to process the mental gymnastics she was performing. The deputies exchanged a look, and asked if I had any documentation proving the land was private. Wordlessly, I went to my truck, pulled out a thick file folder, and handed them the deed, the city's land ownership records, and a fresh surveyor's report. Everything was certified, dated, notarized, and laminated because I knew better than to underestimate local troublemakers. The deputies spent all of 5 minutes flipping through the papers before one of them politely told Karen, "Ma'am, this is private land. This isn't and has never been a public trail. You need to leave." You could almost see the steam come out of her ears. Her face turned a shade of purple I thought only existed in cartoons. "I'll have your job," she screeched at the deputies. "I'm friends with the mayor." Both officers looked unimpressed. "That's great, ma'am," the older one said dryly. "But unless the mayor can rewrite property laws, you're trespassing." At that, Karen changed tactics. She pulled out her phone again and started snapping photos of my property, my gate, my truck, even the deputies, all while muttering to herself, "I'm going to the Historical Preservation Society. I'm going to the news. You'll be sorry. You'll all be sorry," she hissed, backing away like she was starring in a soap opera. I almost expected dramatic music to start playing. She stomped off toward her SUV, still shoeless on one foot, got in, slammed the door so hard it echoed across the valley, and sped off without looking back, leaving behind a cloud of dust and one very sad sandal. I thought maybe that would be the end of it, but deep down, I had a sinking feeling that Karen wasn't done. Not by a long shot. People like her don't back down after one defeat. They double down, dig trenches, and come back swinging. Sure enough, within hours, flyers started appearing around town. "Save our trail!" they screamed, complete with a badly photoshopped picture of me looking like a cartoon villain twirling a mustache. The claims were absurd. I was imprisoning hikers, destroying community heritage, and stealing public resources. It would have been hilarious if it weren't clear she was dead serious. I sat on my porch that evening, sipping sweet tea and staring at the new gate, watching the sun set over my land. I had no regrets about putting the gate up. If anything, I was more determined than ever to protect what was mine. Karen had declared war, and she had no idea what kind of fight she just picked. I smiled to myself, knowing she had already made her first mistake. She had no clue how airtight my ownership rights were, how every document was perfectly in order, or that I had recorded the entire encounter, including her dramatic 911 call and her clumsy fall, on my security cameras. As night fell and the cicadas began to sing, I chuckled softly. If Karen thought the gate was a problem, she was about to find out she had only scratched the surface. The real battle was just beginning, and I was more than ready for it. By Monday morning, it was clear that Karen had spent the entire weekend scheming. I woke up to find neon-colored flyers duct-taped to my mailbox, my fence posts, even the community bulletin board at the gas station. Each flyer was a disaster in design and a masterpiece in lies. In giant, red letters, they screamed about an evil land baron who had destroyed the historic community trail and imprisoned families and children behind steel gates. She even included a dramatic, low-angle photo of my gate taken at sunset, probably hoping it would look more sinister. The real kicker was that she had pasted drone photos of my land. Photos she definitely did not have permission to take or publish. I peeled one of the flyers off my truck windshield and shook my head. If Karen thought bad clip art and buzzwords were going to scare me, she was about to get a very painful education in how the real world works. Later that afternoon, I heard shouting near the back of my property. I took a walk down the trail, phone in hand just in case, and found Karen and about a dozen of her new followers gathered at my gate. They were an odd bunch. A few retirees who looked like they hadn't hiked in years, some teenagers who clearly just came for the drama, and one guy with a megaphone yelling incoherent slogans. They had tied colorful balloons to the fence, taped handmade posters on the gate, and even set up a little folding table with a petition on it. Karen, standing at the front like a general addressing her troops, spotted me and immediately pointed. "There he is!" she shouted, as if she had caught a war criminal trying to escape. The crowd turned to me, a mix of awkward shuffling and weak fist-pumping. I leaned casually against a fence post and raised an eyebrow, waiting to see what flavor of crazy Karen would unleash today. "We demand you open the trail," Karen shrieked, waving a clipboard at me like it was a sword. I calmly asked her if she had brought any documentation proving that it was a public trail. She blinked a few times, clearly not expecting to be challenged. Then she rattled off a speech about common law access rights and historical community traditions, peppering it with made-up legal terms that sounded impressive but meant absolutely nothing. When I asked if she had a lawyer or any official backing, she launched into a long-winded story about how she had connections at City Hall. I nodded, pretending to be impressed, and then told her, very politely, that unless she had a court order or city mandate, she was trespassing. Karen's face twisted in fury. She ordered her little army to stay put and began filming herself, narrating dramatically as if she were reporting live from a disaster zone. I decided it was time to play my hand. I smiled pleasantly and said, "You might want to read the fine print on those flyers you posted." Karen looked confused, so I pulled out my phone and showed her an email from my attorney. It was a cease and desist letter already prepared, citing unauthorized use of drone imagery over private property, unauthorized distribution of said imagery, and defamation. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. I told her she had 24 hours to remove every single flyer, retract every public statement, and issue a public apology, or face a lawsuit that would bury her so deep she'd need a trail map to find her way out. The crowd, sensing that things were not going according to plan, started to murmur and drift away. A few of the more reasonable ones quietly packed up their signs and balloons and slipped off down the street, pretending not to know Karen at all. Karen, realizing she was losing her audience, went into full meltdown mode. She screamed that she would sue me for emotional distress, that she would petition the governor, and that she would march right to the Supreme Court if she had to. I didn't bother responding. I just turned around and walked back to my house, whistling a happy tune, while Karen's voice grew fainter and fainter behind me. By the next morning, most of the flyers had disappeared. I imagined Karen had spent a long, miserable night driving around with a step stool and a roll of duct tape remover, desperately trying to undo her mess. I thought maybe, just maybe, this would be the end of it. Maybe Karen would realize she was outmatched and slink away into the background. I underestimated her again. A few days later, I was woken by honking and shouting outside. I threw on a shirt and ran to the front porch. There, once again, was Karen, but this time she had brought reinforcements. She had organized a public protest at my gate. There were about 20 people milling around, holding poorly spelled signs with slogans like "Open the Public Trail" and "Free the Path." Some even camped out with lawn chairs and coolers like they were tailgating a football game. One guy was grilling hot dogs on a portable barbecue, completely oblivious to why he was even there. Karen spotted me and immediately grabbed a megaphone. "Attention, attention!" she blared, her voice crackling through the cheap speaker. "This man is holding our community hostage. We will not leave until justice is served." She thrust the megaphone toward my face and demanded, "What do you have to say for yourself, you oppressor?" I simply smiled, pulled out my phone, and started recording. "Say cheese, Karen," I said cheerfully. After about an hour of watching them loiter and shout meaningless slogans at the fence, I decided it was time to call in some professionals. I called the sheriff's department and explained the situation. The dispatcher sighed heavily, like she had been dealing with Karen all week, and promised to send someone out. When the deputies arrived, they took one look at the mess, exchanged a few words with Karen, and then gave her a choice: disperse peacefully or face charges for trespassing and unlawful assembly. Karen, sensing the tide turning against her, tried to rally her followers, but by then most of them were hot, tired, sunburned, and realizing they were standing on private property for no good reason. They packed up their grills and lawn chairs and trickled away, leaving Karen alone at the gate, red-faced and sputtering with rage. She kicked over a cooler in frustration, then stormed off muttering threats about lawsuits and civil rights violations. I waved cheerfully as she left, then turned to the deputies and thanked them for their help. As they pulled away, I stood at my gate, looking at the now empty trail and the scattered debris from Karen's failed rebellion. It was over for now, but I knew better than to relax. Karen wasn't the type to give up after a little embarrassment. No, she was the type to double down, and the next time, I had a feeling she would make an even bigger mistake. I locked the gate, smiled to myself, and walked back toward the house, already planning my next move. If Karen wanted a war, she had no idea how prepared I was for the battle ahead. It had been a few quiet days, almost eerily so, and I knew better than to trust it. Karen wasn't the kind of person who admitted defeat or disappeared after losing a public tantrum. No, her silence meant she was cooking up something bigger, something reckless, and sure enough, my hunch proved right late one night when my phone buzzed with an alert from the security system. At first, I thought it might be another deer wandering too close to the fence, but when I checked the live feed, my jaw tightened. There they were, Karen and two of her die-hard loyalists, creeping around the back gate with flashlights and what looked like a pair of heavy-duty wire cutters in Karen's hand. They were fumbling around, trying to find the weakest point in the chain, whispering like a gang of amateur burglars on a bad reality show. I leaned back in my chair, shook my head, and grabbed another soda from the fridge because tonight's entertainment had just begun. Karen positioned herself like a movie villain about to cut the big red wire on a bomb, except this wasn't the movies, and my gate wasn't just chained shut. It was rigged. The second the wire cutters clamped down and broke the chain, hidden motion sensors triggered the entire perimeter system. Floodlights snapped on like stadium lights, alarms screamed to life, and a pre-recorded message blared from the speakers mounted on the gate, announcing in a firm robotic voice that they were being recorded and law enforcement was on the way. Karen shrieked and dropped the wire cutters like they had bitten her. One of her buddies tried to run but tripped over the fence line and landed face-first in a patch of thistles. The third stood frozen, flashlight still shining into his own eyes, looking like a deer in headlights. I stayed in my chair, watching the live stream and sipping my soda as red and blue lights appeared in the distance. Within minutes, 2 sheriff's vehicles roared up the dirt road, skidding to a stop with doors flying open. Deputies poured out, shouting commands that made Karen and her crew snap back to reality real fast. Karen immediately started crying, pointing at the broken chain and babbling about rescuing the trail and historical emergencies, as if those were legitimate legal defenses. Her friends tried blaming each other, each of them claiming they had just tagged along and had no idea Karen was planning to cut through the gate. The deputies weren't buying a word of it. Karen, of course, had to make it worse for herself. Instead of staying quiet like any sane person would, she launched into a full-blown speech about constitutional rights and community heritage, while the deputies tried to cuff her. One of them had to remind her, twice, that she had the right to remain silent, and she ignored both warnings in favor of quoting random amendments completely out of context. They finally got her secured in the back of the cruiser, still shouting about injustices and conspiracies. Her 2 friends were cuffed too, looking a lot less enthusiastic than they had when they first crept onto my land. At the station, Karen continued her one-woman circus act. She demanded to see the police chief, then demanded to see the mayor, then demanded to call the governor, all while the deputies filled out their reports with the exhausted patience of men who had clearly dealt with her type before. When asked why she thought she had the right to destroy a locked gate on private land, she said, and I quote, "Because history belongs to everyone, and this gate is a crime against humanity." When they pointed out she was trespassing, vandalizing, and tampering with private security infrastructure, she accused the deputies themselves of being in on the conspiracy. Meanwhile, her 2 friends had already quietly called their parents for bail. Word traveled fast in small towns, especially when it involved sirens, flashing lights, and people being dragged off in cuffs. By morning, the story had exploded. Everyone at the diner was buzzing about how Karen and her crew had tried to storm the forbidden trail and ended up spending the night behind bars. Someone even started a hashtag on the local community page, #TrailFail. People uploaded memes, one particularly popular one showing Karen dressed like Indiana Jones, swinging a pair of wire cutters over a pit of legal documents. I kept my head down and let the story grow legs on its own. No need to interfere when Karen was busy setting fire to her own reputation. Meanwhile, I met with my attorney to prepare a formal case for property damage and harassment. Not only did Karen's little adventure give me enough evidence to file charges, but it also opened the door to filing a restraining order. I wanted to make sure she couldn't so much as step onto the public road in front of my ranch without facing consequences. When Karen was finally released on bail, she didn't have the triumphant look she usually wore. She looked tired, rumpled, and rattled. But even then, she couldn't help herself. She staged a pitiful press conference outside the sheriff's office, standing in front of a few bored-looking reporters and reading a statement she clearly wrote herself, filled with buzzwords about environmental rights, cultural preservation, and systematic oppression by wealthy landowners. It was equal parts sad and hilarious because while she spoke, One of the deputies leaned casually against his patrol car, openly holding up a copy of the property deed for the cameras to see. I watched a clip of her press conference later, chuckling to myself. Her voice quivered with righteous anger, but her hands kept shaking, and every time someone asked her a basic legal question, she either dodged it or blamed the system. The few reporters who actually showed up didn't bother airing her speech in full. They just cut together the highlights of her getting arrested, fumbling through her defense, and then a short segment featuring my beautifully documented land record. The cherry on top came later that week when I received a letter from the city's legal office. Karen had filed a ridiculous complaint demanding the immediate demolition of my gate. The response from the city attorney was a masterpiece of dry, bureaucratic savagery, politely informing her that not only was my gate fully permitted and legal, but if she pursued frivolous claims again, she could be held liable for court costs and damages. I framed that letter and hung it right next to the gate's deed. It was clear by now that Karen had crossed the point of no return. She wasn't just a noisy neighbor anymore. She was a full-fledged public nuisance, and every move she made only dug her deeper. I tightened the security around the property, installed a few more cameras, and settled in for what I knew would be a long but inevitable victory. Karen had declared war, but she brought a toy sword to a battle where I had the law, patience, and an endless supply of popcorn on my side. The court date came faster than anyone expected. I had spent the days leading up to it preparing meticulously with my attorney, organizing every document, photo, and video into neat little folders ready for battle. I wanted this to be thorough, undeniable, and most importantly, permanent. Karen, on the other hand, spent her days ranting online about how she was being silenced and oppressed, posting long, rambling screeds filled with caps lock fury and legal terms she clearly didn't understand. She even tried to start a GoFundMe titled, "Save Our Trail," but it barely raised enough for a cup of coffee. Meanwhile, the town's sympathy for her had evaporated like a puddle in the desert. Everyone was tired of the drama. People just wanted her to stop embarrassing the town, but Karen seemed determined to dig herself even deeper into her own hole. The morning of the hearing, I arrived early, wearing a clean-collared shirt and jeans, looking every bit the calm, reasonable landowner just trying to protect his rights. Karen showed up 15 minutes late, wearing what I assumed was her version of a courtroom outfit, a white blouse with a giant Justice for Trails button pinned to it and hiking boots caked in dried mud. She stormed into the courtroom with the energy of someone who thought they were about to deliver the speech of a lifetime, head high, a thick folder clutched to her chest like a shield. Her supporters, once a noisy crowd, had dwindled to 2 elderly women and a teenage boy who looked more interested in his phone than the proceedings. As the hearing started, the judge, a no-nonsense woman known for her patience running thinner than paper, asked both sides to present their evidence. My attorney calmly stood up and, without any drama, laid everything out. Certified land deeds showing clear private ownership. County survey records confirming no public easement had ever existed. The permit approvals for the gate construction. The security footage showing Karen cutting the chain, along with timestamps and GPS markers. The photos of Karen's flyers using unauthorized drone shot. Each piece of evidence stacked neatly atop the last until it was a wall no desperate speech could climb over. When it was Karen's turn, she stood up, hands trembling slightly, and launched into a rambling monologue about the soul of the community, ancestral walking paths, and how corporate greed was destroying local traditions. She had no legal documents, no map, no expert testimony, just a lot of emotions and a few blurry cell phone photos that didn't even show my land clearly. The judge let her finish, patiently scribbling notes, then asked a few direct questions. When Karen couldn't produce a single piece of real evidence to support her claim that the trail was public, the judge's expression turned from neutral to downright unimpressed. My attorney asked for damages for the vandalized gate, legal fees, and a permanent restraining order against Karen entering or approaching my property. Karen, desperate, objected loudly, claiming she had been defending civil liberties. But the judge quickly shut her down, reminding her that trespassing and destruction of private property were not protected under any law, no matter how passionately she believed in her cause. Then came the final blow. The judge, almost with a hint of pity, informed Karen that due to her unauthorized use of drone photography and public defamation campaign, she could also face additional civil suits if I chose to pursue them. The judgment was swift. Karen was fined for trespassing, ordered to pay restitution for the gate damages, hit with a permanent restraining order that barred her from coming within 500 feet of my property, and given 30 days to issue a public retraction of all her false claims. The moment the gavel hit the desk, Karen's face crumbled. She stood frozen, fists clenched at her sides, trembling with suppressed rage. Her supporters awkwardly shuffled out of the courtroom without saying a word. Outside the courthouse, a few local reporters had gathered, hoping to catch a juicy quote. I simply nodded politely, declined to comment, and headed straight to my truck. Karen, however, could not resist the spotlight. She stormed toward the cameras and began another of her infamous speeches, ranting about injustice and corruption, tears streaking down her cheek. It would have been almost sad if it wasn't so absurd. In the background, a few townspeople watched, shaking their heads in disbelief that she was still trying to spin her loss into some kind of noble crusade. Within hours, the local news had the story up online, complete with a brutal headline: Gatekeeper wins legal battle, trail claims proven false. They didn't even bother editing Karen's meltdown, airing clips of her shouting nonsense and blaming everyone from the sheriff's department to the federal government for her defeat. Comments poured in, and it became immediately clear that the public wasn't buying her narrative anymore. The sympathy she once tried to stir had completely dried up. Now, she was just the town punchline, the woman who thought a gate was a national crisis and ended up losing everything trying to fight it. In the following days, Karen's life seemed to unravel at a speed that was almost hard to watch. She was removed from the local historical society for bringing disrepute to the organization. Stores she used to frequent gave her the cold shoulder. Her online rants became increasingly unhinged, filled with conspiracy theories so wild even her few remaining followers started backing away. Someone even started a mock Facebook group titled Historical Preservation of Private Property, featuring memes of Karen photoshopped into famous battles waving a pair of bolt cutters like a sword. Meanwhile, I went about my life with a new sense of peace. I upgraded my gate security system just for good measure, not because I thought Karen would try again. After the restraining order, she wouldn't dare, but because it gave me a quiet satisfaction to know that everything was locked down tighter than ever. The trail was mine, legally and permanently, and nothing she said or did could ever change that. One evening, as I sat on my porch sipping coffee, a neighbor from down the road stopped by. He shook my hand, chuckling, and said, "You're a legend now. Never seen anyone take on Karen and come out this clean." I laughed, feeling a genuine sense of relief. It wasn't just about winning the case or keeping the trail private. It was about standing my ground against a wave of entitlement and insanity that had tried to trample over common sense. I had drawn the line, and Karen had run straight into it headfirst. I leaned back in my chair, watching the last rays of sunlight dip behind the hills, the air cool and still. The trail was quiet, the land peaceful, exactly how it should be. For the first time in months, there were no shouts, no flyers, no protests. Just the gentle hum of crickets and the whisper of the wind through the trees. The battle was over, the war won, and all it had cost me was patience, preparation, and the unshakable certainty that truth, unlike Karen's flyers, didn't tear so easily in the wind. The days following the court decision were like stepping into a new version of my life, one where the air felt lighter and my land felt even more like mine. Karen had been legally banished from my property, her reputation shattered into 1,000 tiny pieces, and her constant chaos silenced for good. Still, A small part of me knew that when someone like Karen loses a war, they don't walk away gracefully. They limp away, bruised and bitter, and occasionally try one last desperate swipe. I was ready for it, but it still managed to be even more pathetic than I had imagined. It started with small, petty things. Someone dumped a pile of balloons tied with "Save the Trail" notes near my fence, as if that would guilt-trip me into tearing down the gate. Another time, someone, almost certainly Karen, left a box of old hiking boots and trail maps just outside my property line with a handwritten note that said, "You can't erase history." I laughed every time I found these sad little gestures, each one more desperate than the last. I didn't react publicly, didn't give her the attention she craved. I knew that silence would sting her more than any confrontation ever could. But Karen wasn't done embarrassing herself. She decided to organize one final act of resistance. A so-called bike-in protest at the end of the trail where the public road met my private gate. She made a dozen Facebook posts about it, calling it the last ride for freedom. She even designed a poster that looked like a bad 80s movie cover, complete with cartoon eagles and a photoshopped image of herself on a bicycle holding a flag. I heard about it from a neighbor who showed me the event page online, struggling not to laugh. According to Karen's grand plan, dozens of bikers were supposed to show up, storm the trail, and demand the gate be taken down. She scheduled it for a Saturday afternoon, the perfect time for maximum visibility. When the day arrived, I couldn't resist watching. I set up a lawn chair just inside my fence, sipped lemonade, and waited. Noon came and went. The only crowd that gathered was two teenagers on scooters who looked confused, an elderly man on a tricycle who clearly just wanted some exercise, and one Uber Eats driver who appeared after getting lost looking for a nearby house. Karen herself arrived 20 minutes late, wheeling a rusted-out bike with one flat tire, wearing a t-shirt that read "Trail Freedom Fighter" in giant, peeling letters. She looked around at the empty road, her face falling as she realized no one was coming. For a few minutes, she stood there stubbornly, trying to pose like a hero standing at the gates of injustice. But it was just her, a sad little bike, and a broken dream. I stayed silent, letting her stew in her failure. Eventually she snapped. She tossed her bike onto the grass, kicked a pebble into the fence, screamed something incoherent about corruption, and stormed back to her car. She peeled out so fast that gravel sprayed everywhere, some of it bouncing harmlessly off the gate she had failed to defeat. That was the last time I saw Karen try anything near my land. It was a fitting final act, not with a bang but with a whimper. With Karen gone and peace fully restored, I decided it was time to add something new to the gate. I hired a local metalworker to craft a custom sign, a playful nod to the entire saga. A few weeks later, he delivered it, a beautiful wrought iron plaque mounted above the gate, reading "Private Trail," protected by common sense and court orders. Beneath it, in smaller letters, it said, "All trespassers will be live-streamed for your entertainment." It wasn't petty. It wasn't cruel. It was just the perfect reminder that stupidity had consequences and that some battles, once won, deserved a trophy. Word about the sign spread fast, and soon enough, people started stopping by, not to trespass but just to take photos from the public road, laughing and shaking their heads. The sign became a small tourist attraction. It even made it onto a local blogger's Top 10 Weirdest Things to See in Town list, right between the world's largest pecan sculpture and a mailbox shaped like a cow. I didn't mind. If anything, it turned the whole ridiculous experience into something positive. I met new neighbors, made a few friends, and even got a couple of barbecue invites from folks who respected how I had handled the whole mess without losing my mind. Life returned to normal faster than I expected. My days were filled with work around the property, fixing fences, tending to the garden, and enjoying long, quiet evenings by the porch. The trail behind my gate, once a battleground of ego and entitlement, went back to being what it always should have been, a peaceful path for me and my dogs to walk without fear of being ambushed by megaphones and flyers. Every now and then, I would sit by the trail, watching the sun dip below the hills, the sky painted in strokes of orange and purple, and think about how close I had come to losing something precious just because one person couldn't accept the word no. Karen eventually faded into a bitter memory. I heard she moved a few towns over, where hopefully someone else's fence would catch her attention instead of mine. Her old social media accounts went dark, and nobody talked about her anymore, except as the punchline to a few inside jokes. It was a quiet end to a loud, messy story, the kind of ending that doesn't come with fireworks or big speeches, just the sweet, simple satisfaction of being left alone. As for me, I never forgot the lesson Karen taught me, even if she didn't mean to. I learned that standing up for yourself isn't about shouting louder or throwing more tantrums. It's about being calm, being prepared, and trusting that when you're right, you don't have to flail and scream to prove it. The truth has a way of standing tall on its own, like a well-built gate no bolt cutter can break. And so, my trail remained mine. My land remained protected. My peace remained intact. And every time I passed under that iron sign, every time I heard someone chuckle at its message, I was reminded that some victories aren't just about winning a fight. They're about making sure that the people who tried to steal your peace realize they never even stood a chance.